Hanukkah, oh Hanukkah, come light the menorah. Let's join the party, we'll all dance the hora. Gather round the table, we'll give you a treat, a silly one to play with and latkes to eat. And while we are playing, the candles are burning low. One for each night they shed a sweet light to remind us of days long ago. One for each night they shed a sweet light to remind us of days long ago. Oh Hanukkah, a time to remember. Jolly, jolly holiday that comes in December.
Welcome back to our fourth session at St. Andrew's. We're going to be looking at Hanukkah. Now, I'm going to have to do a lot of history today for us to understand this celebration of Hanukkah. So I need you to kind of get ready for a history lesson. But behind it, I think, will break open for you an incredible feast and something Jesus used to declare His divinity. So get ready. I'll meet you in the parish hall. Well, here we go. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Open our hands, open our hearts, Lord, open our minds, and help us to take in all of this information and then sort it out for us, Lord, as we take a look at Jesus and all that Jesus said in this feast. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, we are going to look at Hanukkah, but before we do that, let me just remind you with a quick review, real quick, that we've already looked at Sabbath. That's the one we started with, Sabbat. We've looked at Passover, which is Pesach. And then last week we looked at the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles. It's got two titles, and we call that Sukkot. And today we're going to be looking at the Feast of the Dedication, or the Feast of Lights, and that is called Hanukkah. I'm going to be doing a lot of history, okay? So hang in there. Probably less scripture and more history. But if you don't understand the history, you won't understand Hanukkah and the interesting developments that take place in this feast. But we're trying to work through the Gospel of John, looking at key points, key handholds as we scale this Gospel. And those key handholds for this session are the feasts. So we look at Sabbath and Passover, etc. And today we'll be looking at Hanukkah. Now we got to look at the history, and so that's what we're going to start with. First of all, 323 BC with Alexander's death, and that time ends in 31 BC with the conquest of all Hellenistic kingdom by Rome. So that's a huge chunk of time. But I want you to see the influence of the Hellenistic culture across the known world. And I'll have a map for you in just a moment to see just how broad Alexander the Great conquered. Then, after 31 BC, during this tumultuous time of about 148 BC all the way through to 31 BC, we have lots of stuff, intrigue going on in Israel or Palestine. Aristobulus II, 66 BC, he was from the Hasmonean dynasty. He becomes king and high priest of Judea. There was a point there when you had Syria in control, actually Egypt had some control there too, is that they would put in place like-minded high priests who also became the governors of that time. And so they were governor and they were also high priest. So Aristobulus is one we need to look at. He was high priest of Judea until 63, and then 63 BC on, Rome sends Pompey the Great and his forces to Judea to intervene in a civil war that's going on between the two religious sects. Those who were in favor of Hellenistic influence and those who were in favor of a more Egyptian influence, because the Egyptians allowed for a more conservative Judaism and the Hellenists wanted a more progressive Judaism. And so you have that's why there's a civil war going on. And so Pompey comes in and takes control over the whole kingdom in order to control the civil war. All right, so now let's take a look at the map. I want you to see how broad the Hellenistic empire was. So you got Greece over here, and the Alexander the Great took over Macedonia first, but then there was this sweep that went east. And you see he went as far over here. Now this is probably today northwest Pakistan, all of Afghanistan. I'm not sure how far into what would be modern day India they went, or if it was just along here that they stopped. He wanted to move into this area, that is Alexander the Great. You see that he came down through Palestine and he took a great deal of Egypt in here. Notice, for those of you who are with our Muslim studies, notice that only the coastline of Arabia was impacted. Nobody wanted to go into the center of what we know today as Saudi Arabia. That was a major undertaking, if anyone wanted to do that. So anyway, here we've got the Hellenistic Empire, and it's huge. It's absolutely huge, and I'm amazed at how far east it extended. Now, how long do you think it took Alexander the Great to take over this area? You have any idea? No.
He died at what, 33 years old?
He died exactly, Don. He died at 33 years old.
That was very fast.
He started the conquest at age 23. So he only lived 10 years, but in 10 years, look what he accomplished. He died. There's a I can't remember. It's in Maryland. I think it's a medical group in Maryland determined that from the historical documentation that it looks like Alexander the Great died from typhoid fever. And we're told that he died along the Mesopotamian valley, either up in northern Iraq or all the way down to Babylon, but in this area. And there was lots of typhoid fever going on at the time. Now, after the death of Alexander the Great, I'm painting with a very broad brush here, so there are lots of details that are missing in what I'm about to say, but I need to get to the big picture. After the death of Alexander the Great, then the empire was divided up into between 4 generals. And that meant that 2 of the generals had the largest chunk of property. And it went to the Seleucids out of Syria, and it went to Ptolemy, which is out of Egypt. So let me show you this. There's the Ptolemaic Empire right there. So he's taking a little bit more of Egypt all the way down, but there you have the Ptolemaic Empire. Now this, let's see. There you have the Seleucid Empire. Notice that it extends almost as far east. I think this map shows us that he's probably given up some of what would today be a western Pakistan. And I'm not sure about that. I'm just, if the map's accurate, that might be what it is. But I want you to see, and this is not a good map, I know, right down here, the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire meet right here in Palestine. So you have two major empires meeting in Palestine. Jerusalem's right down about here. For those, Gail and Marilyn, when we went to, no, you didn't go to Jordan with me, did you? No, you didn't. But remember the Nabatean Empire? The Nabateans are the ones that had Petra. What's interesting is that it's not until Rome comes in do the Nabateans then have real pushback from any of these empires. But and nobody really wanted to mess with the Nabateans because they were the masters at trade. And the trade routes would go right through or right around Petra. And so Petra was a huge place where these cultures would come and exchange their trade with one another. But anyway, it's just fascinating to me that the Nabateans avoided everything until Rome came along, and then Rome extended further over. So here's the battle. There's the battle in Palestine. You got a picture of that now. Now I want you to show you Rome. This is the Roman Empire. Notice that Rome goes as far as Armenia and Syria. Rome does not go into to Iran and does not go into Afghanistan. All of that they're not going to push that far east. But they have instead pushed all the way to Britannia. So they moved all the way to the United Kingdom and extend to Spain. Now, and notice that Rome has now taken northern Africa. Now, the Hellenists did not get that far. Ptolemy did not push any further than right here, but Rome did. And this is significant because a great deal of our early Christian theology comes from some incredible Northern African thinkers like Augustine. So you have this Christian influence here, and it shapes and molds in many ways Christian theology right up to this very day. So you have to understand these massive movements of empires to get a hold of this little feast we're going to talk about today that's called Hanukkah. Now let me catch up with my notes, okay? I just blew ahead of my notes. So the Hellenistic Empire brought with it, of course, its Hellenistic culture. That meant a Greek culture. So you start seeing throughout the Hellenistic Empire Greek architecture, Greek dress. The Greek language was everywhere. And in Israel, as well as down in Egypt, Greek was spoken quite freely. So Greek then, this Hellenistic culture was just all over through basically the eastern side of the known world. Now, when there was a split, when the generals divided things up, and you have you have the Potomac on one side and the Seleucid on the other side, and Palestine is the dividing line between the two of them. Both of those generals want, and their descendants, they want more power. And so I'm going to refer to the Potomac Empire now as Egyptian, and I'll refer to the Seleucid Empire as Syria. The Syrian Empire wanted Egypt, and the Egyptian Empire wanted Syria. They wanted to become, they wanted it all. So there's this battle, this push back and forth through Palestine. Some scholars said that when the Jews in Jerusalem woke up every morning, they didn't know if they were Syrian or they didn't know if they were Egyptian. It was just that kind of a push back and forth as to who was going to control the real estate along that area. And I'll go back to this one here. No, I'll go back further. That's better. So if Syria was in control, and they would put in a puppet governor, and the governor would be the high priest, and so the Syrians then put in place a high priest by the name of Jason. Jason was kind of a moderate between the conservative wing of Judaism and the more progressive wing of Judaism. But he really liked Hellenistic culture. And so he did whatever he could to put in place to Hellenize Jerusalem as much as he possibly could. And that meant he put in a gymnasium. And if you remember your Greek history, you remember the gymnasium was a place where Greek athletes would wrestle or spar naked. Now that didn't go over real well with the Jews because that just wasn't the way you did things. So Jason messed up right off the bat with that. There's also, and I didn't remember seeing it this last time I was at the model in Jerusalem of first and second century Jerusalem, but I do remember when it was. See, the model had been moved. It moved from a hotel on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and then they moved it to the Israeli Museum. And so, but I remember a hippodrome in first century, the model of first century Jerusalem. I remember a hippodrome, and I could not find it this last time I was there. So I'm not sure it made the trip from the hotel where it was originally built. But nevertheless, I saw it. It was there, a hippodrome. What's a hippodrome? That's the place where they would race horses and chariots and stuff. It was very, 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 very Greek. And Gail, I don't know if you remember, but when we went to Jordash in Jordan, that was one of the most well-preserved Roman cities in all of the Middle East. I mean, it is spectacular. And it has not an intact hippodrome, but probably one of the best preserved hippodromes that there is. So it's really fascinating. Anyway, all of this Hellenistic influence. Now, the other side of the coin, as I've already told you, is that you've got Egypt, you've got the Ptolemies, and what they were not, Hellenistic influence, it was okay, not bad, but they really weren't about Hellenizing the world. They just wanted the world, okay? And so when they would push and have control over Jerusalem, the conservative Jewish component of Judaism kind of liked the Egyptian because the Egyptians didn't push anything, and there was more of a connection between the Egyptians and conservative Judaism than there was between conservative Judaism and the progressive Hellenists. Now the Hellenists were the ones who created, they created an aristocracy that Jerusalem had never seen before. So there was this emerging wealthy component to Judaism in Jerusalem that they'd never seen before. It was either the king and his court, or king and his court, and everybody else kind of an emerging middle class, but everyone else much poorer. With Hellenistic culture, there was an aristocracy raising up. There was money to be made and money to be spent. They wanted the Hellenistic. They wanted Syria in there because it preserved their status quo. And so that's why you get this civil war. You get this civil war between progressive and conservative in Judaism coming at one another. Jason was deposed eventually. There was a big push made by the Syrians to come down and once and for all take the Egyptians, and so they had to pass through Jerusalem, and Antiochus, who was the king at that time, he decided to take everything he could out of the temple, and they took over the temple, and then but it was an unsuccessful push against the Egyptians, and so they retreated back. And a year later, Antiochus came back down from Syria, and this time he told his army, if someone is in favor of the Egyptians, kill them. If they're in favor of us, let them live. And what happened was a huge massacre, because the army could care less. They just went in and started killing people. So it was a huge massacre in Jerusalem under Antiochus. But Antiochus then allows the temple to be used for idols. And so the pagan Hellenistic idols were brought into the temple proper. It was overgrown with foliage. It was unkept. It had been the priest quarters had been destroyed. Now, there is a conservative, and his name is Judas Maccabeus. Judas Maccabeus. Now, Judas comes along and rallies the troops, the conservative side, to come and regain Jerusalem. And within a 3-year period, the rebels, so to speak, under Judas Maccabeus, have conquered the Syrians and drove the Syrians back, and so they take over their city again. Now, Judas Maccabeus and his entourage enter into the temple. Now, there are two stories. And the first story is that they entered into the temple proper, and there it was, an absolute utter destroyed in all these idols and everything. And they went to light the candles with the oil, but discovered that the Syrians had touched that and opened that stuff, and therefore it was contaminated. And so they couldn't use it, because they only could use holy water in this area, holy oil. But then they found a small flask, and on that flask was the seal of the high priest, which told them that it was still set aside as holy. And so they took the flask and they poured it into the oil candles, lit the candles, and the candles miraculously stayed lit for 8 days. And the reason that's significant is that they had to come in and they had to do a whole rework of the temple. And that meant rebuilding a brand new altar. And that took 8 days to do, not to mention pulling rocks out, stones out, or washing and cleansing. And so while all of this refurbishing was going on, the oil held for 8 days.
They sacrificed things on that altar. That's why they had to redo it, right? They had sacrifices.
Yeah, Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificed a pig on the altar. Yeah, I'm sure he sacrificed other things too. So that's one story. The other story is that when they entered into the Holy of Holies, they discovered 3 spears. Not 3, excuse me. They discovered 8 spears. And what they immediately did is they took those spears and they used them as to hold candles, and so they could get light in the temple proper, so that they could start to rebuild it. And now I'm telling you this because Hanukkah's emphasis on light is really important, and its emphasis on 8 candles is really important. Thus you have a menorah. The menorah is 4 candles on either side of a center candle. Now, last night we were blessed to have a Jewish lady with us, and she came and brought her favorite menorah. And what was interesting is that it wasn't a traditional menorah. Instead, it was very modern art, and it was quite beautiful, actually. And she explained to us that the center candle is always lit, and then you place the other candles in, and on each night of Hanukkah, and there are 8 nights a celebration for Hanukkah. You light one and you say a prayer, a specific prayer over that first candle, second candle, third candle, etc. And when you light them, you don't extinguish them. You let them burn down. So as she laughingly said, it gets all over your table, and that's just the way it is. And so you get all this this wax is just going all over. But the light is important because it commemorates a miracle that God did when after the Jewish people, the rebels, if you will, in this case, pushed out the opposition and took over their temple. And it's rededicated. When the rededication is, it's given back to God. So this is some of the important stuff that emerges out of the history of Hanukkah. Now, some of the scholars, like the primary scholar that I've already mentioned multiple times that I've been reading, sometimes I wonder if he's a believer because he basically talks about the Hanukkah event as a legend, and that it was really political. It was a political movement, and it was a political success. And his point is, and I understand his point. It makes sense, is that if they didn't have a religious component to this, the feast day would never have survived. You see, on the 8th day after they had cleansed it and it was ready, the temple was ready to go, Judas Maccabeus declared that they would celebrate the dedication of the temple every year. And the scholar's point is that if it hadn't been for a religious component, this political recognition would have died early on, but it stayed, and it kept getting stronger and stronger and stronger because of the miracle that was the story about God's miracle in the midst of this political event in Israel's history. So Hanukkah then is celebrated in conjunction with, and I'm talking about the very first time when they rededicated the temple, it is celebrated in conjunction with the Feast of Booths. Because under Syria, in particular, they were not allowed to sacrifice in the temple. They were not allowed to have their celebrations, their religious celebrations. So the Feast of Booths and Passover and all of that had not been going on during this time frame. And so when they were ready to dedicate the temple, they dedicated basically as Feast of Booths, which also has its emphasis on light, doesn't it, Marilyn? Booths. I have a hard time saying booths.
B-O-O-T-H.
Yeah. I'll go to tabernacles now,
It's the same feast.
Well, yeah. Yeah, feast, yeah. So, yeah, that's right. Okay, yeah, I know. Everyone says, what? When I say that.
Well, good, I'm not the only one.
You're not the only one, let me tell you. Everyone screws their face up at me and goes, what? Booths.
It's hard to say that.
It is. So the Feast of Booths then is celebrated in the context of Hanukkah. And so they realize that the Feast of Tabernacles Booths is an 8-day feast, right? And they have created yet another 8-day feast then with Hanukkah. And they're going, oh my gosh, we can't hang around here 16 days. So eventually there's a separation of the two feasts. And the Feast of Dedication is pushed 2 months, roughly 2 months, into basically December. From the autumn feast of the Feast of Tabernacles, now they have a winter feast the Feast of the Dedication. And that was to give its own place and its own right for celebration, instead of confusing the two together. And that's why many times, because of the lunar calendar, the Jewish people celebrate Hanukkah on what we call Christmas. Okay, so that's the reason. But there was a separating out that took place, and part of that was, look, we've got this long time between autumn and spring, and it gets pretty gray and it's cold, and we need something to lift our spirits, and so let's have a winter feast, and so let's have a party in winter, and so Hanukkah was the one. Hanukkah steadily, progressively becomes more and more and more important in the life of Judaism. So it doesn't die out. It has life and momentum to it. All right, so let me talk to you a little bit about the feast itself. There are several customs and ceremonies, and when we talked with our Jewish friend about some of the things that I talked about, she scratched her head and said, "I've never heard of that." So some of what I'm going to give you, I suspect, comes from Eastern European holidays, Jewish holidays, and Eastern Europeans developed some of their own stuff. So the first thing is, of course, the lights and the kindling of the lights. Now, the lighting of the lights took place in the home. That was a home event. Then, after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, I always go back to that. That's a huge, even for Christians, it's a huge time, a date. The 70 AD, when the temple is destroyed by Tiberius, the Roman general Tiberius. Now that changes what the Jewish feasts look like. That just changes everything. And so what happens with Hanukkah? Well, now eventually the synagogue has a more prominent role in Jewish worship. And so the synagogue also picks up the lighting of menorahs. In the Eastern European tradition, we talked a little bit way back on when we were talking about Sabbath. We talked about this place called the Jewish study hall, and that's in European culture, synagogues would have a study hall. Now, the study hall then would be lit with menorahs, and it just brought a sense of difference. It brought a sense of it brought a lighter feel to the study hall where people were reading the Torah. And so it was something that was looked forward to, especially in winter. The children were put through some pretty rigid study schedules. And so their days were rigidly defined by study and by Hebrew and by the Torah and other things. And it got to be a real grind. So by the time Hanukkah shows up, then they have half days at school. So everyone's looking forward to the Hanukkah break. And in fact, the teachers then would usually play games with the kids during the morning. This would go for 8 days. So everyone was looking forward to this break in, and so a lot of Hanukkah takes place in the home, like it does at Passover. But there's this new development with the synagogue that emerges, and they're also taking on the lighting of the menorah. So light is real important in the celebration of Hanukkah. Then there's this thing called the cheese dishes, and these were and see, this was really interesting because our Jewish friend last night was saying, cheese, no way. not on a feast day because it's dairy and you don't do that and all this kind of stuff. And I'm going, I know, but man, that's what they were saying, that there was this thing called cheese pancakes. And I think it sounds great personally. Then I told the story of Judith. And they celebrate with delicacies such as cheese pancakes, which may have turned into potato pancakes later on. But I think it, if the historian is correct, this at some point cheese pancakes were important. And this is the story. The Hasmonean daughter Judith fed cheese to the enemy, and when they got thirsty, after having eaten all this cheese, they got thirsty. She would give them wine to drink, and they would just guzzle wine and get drunk as a skunk, and then she would cut their heads off. So, our Jewish friend said, "Oh yeah, in National Jewish Museum in New York City, I think it is." She said, "I remember. There's a massive, big old canvas, and it shows this woman holding the head of a bad guy, and underneath it, she said, it says Judith Conquest." And so all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, maybe this stuff is real, And so she learned something, and we learned something in the interaction. And then they do something very interesting that I would love to. In fact, I've seen these in Israel every time I go, and I've been tempted to pick one up. But it's called a dreidel top. Remember? Have you know about dreidels? Yeah. Well, let me show you a dreidel. Yeah. There's the dreidel. Now, that's not the dreidel. There it is. That's the temple. All right, so a dreidel is a top, and it's a four-sided top. And on each side are these Hebrew letters: Nun, Gimel, Che, Shin. Nun, Gimel, Che, Shin. Now, each one of these has a meaning to it. And let me see if I can get to my notes here. The Nun means nothing. Okay? Just think about that. It means nothing. The Gimel means everything. The Che means half. And the Shin means put in. So, put in. Put in. So this is how you play. You got a penny ante up. Everybody has a penny. And I understand that at some point it turned out to be then you had a nut that you would use. And today, going to the website, it says you can use M&Ms, you can use raisins, you can use anything you want. But originally it was a penny. And so, and as our Jewish friend said, probably the beginnings of gambling started here. And so you would put a penny in, everyone ante up, and then I don't know how you choose who goes first, but the first person goes, spins the top, waits for the top to stop, and then whatever letter is up tells you what you're going to do. You either don't get anything and it moves to the next person, or you get everything, you get the whole ante, or you get half of the ante, or you have to throw another penny in if it turns up on a shin. Okay. Apparently this was really popular, and especially during the period of time of the Maccabean revolt, because the Hellenists would say kids were not allowed to read their Torah during the Syrian occupation. And so kids would be reading their Torah, and then an authority would be coming by, and they'd put it away, and they'd pull out their tops, and they'd start spinning their tops. And then, what are you doing? They're saying, well, we're just spinning our dreidels, And so that legend tells us that that's the beginning of what became this game of dreidel. So that takes place on Hanukkah. But there's also other things that they do. They like to play a lot of cards. And it's not that that's a modern addition to Hanukkah. Apparently, card playing was a real popular pastime. And then they would play charades, or they would do puzzles, just all kinds of games. Now, and so notice that both with the Feast of Tabernacles in autumn and now the Feast of Dedication in winter, having a good time is really important. It's about fun. So your family and friends would come over and they'd be playing games and dreidels and charades, and so it would be a great time. And by the way, on Friday night, here at St. Andrews, we have game night. So we're putting this to work. It's just a time to have fun. Okay, so that's about all I have on Hanukkah. Oh, I know what I want to tell you. This is an acronym, and the acronym is Nez Godal Hoyo Shom. A great miracle happened there. A great miracle happened there. Okay? Nez Godal Hoyo Shom. All right, before we go into our biblical side of this, any questions or comments that you have? Okay, this is Bible time. So I want you to open up to John chapter 10. And remember now, Jesus has been in at the Passover. Let's see, what did we do last week? Oh, no, the Feast of Booths. He's been at the Feast of Booths in chapters 7, 8, I think 9 also. And now we've moved to 10. 10 in verses 1 through 21 are packed with I am the good shepherd statements. So Jesus is basically saying, I'm the shepherd, you're the sheep, and I take care of you. That's my responsibility. And there are those in my flock, and there are those who are not in my flock. Now we move to chapter 10, verse 22. And this is what it says. At that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter. So clearly we've got a separation by first century, that separation between the Feast of Tabernacles and the Feast of Dedication. And Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. All right, let's pause right there. So here's the temple proper. This is the court of the Gentiles. This is the court of the women. Then here's the Holy of Holies right there, okay? The colonnades, Solomon's colonnades are right along here. They're 2 pillars thick, deep in here. This is not considered temple proper. This is not considered the temple. This is where teaching takes place. But to step out of there onto this court here is to enter the temple. Or to come up through one of these doors right here, you're entering into the temple. This is not the temple. Jesus does lots of teaching here in Solomon's colonnade, as well as hundreds of other rabbis are doing teaching with their disciples under here also. So the reason that's important is that, remember, the last time we were together, we talked about how Jesus left the temple. He left the temple, okay? Don had a remarkable observation about that. It's as if the Shekinah glory left the temple. If you know your Old Testament, and that the Shekinah glory was invited to be a part of the temple, the first temple that Solomon built. So that's the very presence of God is invited, and the presence of God walks away. Now, it says that he came to the temple, but it also emphasizes that he came to to Solomon's colonnade here, which means he did not enter the temple. And that's why I think Don's observation is absolutely superb. He left, and when he left for good. All right? That was an interesting thing to say with our Jewish friend here last night. So
What did she say?
she didn't bristle at all, but it was but anyway, that's I think it's a good understanding. But he comes back to teach, and he's teaching on the Feast of the Dedication. Now let's pick up on verse 24. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." Jesus answered them, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me. But you do not believe because you are not part of my flock. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one." That, in my opinion, is the crescendo of Jesus' self-declaration of his identity as God. They are one substance, if you will, So Jesus then, in the colonnade of Solomon, on the Feast of the Dedication, which day we don't know, but he declares to the leaders, this is apparently here, this is the leadership, he declares to the leadership that he and the Father are one. And now what are they asking him? Tell us clearly, are you the Christ? And Jesus' response is, "That's what I've been telling you. I mean, weren't you here 2 months ago at the Feast of the Tabernacles when I declared I was the light and I was the water?" So the question then is, what's the significance of this declaration, "I and the Father are one," at the Feast of the Dedication? Now, I want you to think about that. I don't want to spoon feed you on this. I'd like you to think about what might be the connector here. Why did Jesus choose this feast, if in fact it was significant to his declaration?
They're rededicating the temple. Jesus is the temple, in essence.
In essence, yeah. Gail said this is the celebration of the rededication of the temple.
They're celebrating him.
And Jesus is the temple. So they were and it's like a rededication to God incarnate. It's here's the temple, and God promises to be here. He's not challenging that, but he's saying, "I'm the real deal here," and so you ought to be dedicating yourself, to me as the second person of the Trinity. He doesn't use that vocabulary. That's us looking back into it. But as the second person of the Trinity, you ought to be rededicating yourself to me. Well, tell us clearly. He says, "I have, for goodness sake. I have told you." What else? Anything else jump out at you?
Clear can I be?
Yeah, how much more clear can I be? Yeah, anything else?
They didn't understand because they weren't in his flock.
Right. Isn't that an interesting statement? Don said they didn't understand, and Jesus says because they were not in his flock. And we get a lot of that leading up from 1 through 21. There are those in, there are those out. Though you're in, I'm going to protect you. He doesn't say necessarily, if I remember correctly, that he excludes anyone, but there are those who do choose not to come into his flock. And he has a responsibility with those who come in, who are his to protect. He says, "So you're not part of my flock. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. So we've got this shepherd imagery, we've got this dedication ceremony, and we've got Jesus making this incredible declaration, I and the Father are one. In one sense, let me also go this direction. Jesus embodies, in the very best sense of it, what the Maccabees did when they drove out pagans and rededicated the temple as a new and abiding place for worship. Kind of what you were saying, Gail. Jesus embodies what the Maccabees did when they drove the pagans out and rededicated the temple. There's this purity of purpose in mind that, and Jesus brings it to the temple at this feast. Any other thoughts? I mean, the application seems pretty simple. We had to do so much history to make sense of this feast, but I think the application when it comes to the Gospel of John is pretty straightforward and simple.
He's starting a new era. This is a new beginning, in a way.
Yeah, Don says that he's starting a new era. This is a new beginning. I think you're right. Now, where does he go from here? He heads out of the temple, doesn't he, after this, and goes over the Mount of Olives, down into probably past Jericho, and then he goes over to the Jordan, across the Jordan, to the area where John the Baptist did his healings, or excuse me, his baptisms. So the baptismal spot actually is, I do believe, more on down by the Jordanian border of today, and it really is kind of a, you can just see that you go up the mountain and over to get to Jerusalem from that place. It's not up in Galilee. That's not the place of baptism. The place of baptism is way down closer to the Dead Sea. And so he goes there, he hangs out there. Then what happens in chapter 11?
He goes to heals Lazarus.
Lazarus, yeah, he's dead, or he's sick, and they send an envoy to him to say, Lord, please come. And Jesus says, yeah, we'll get to it. He doesn't say it that way, but yeah, we'll get to it. Yeah. Well, he's just up the mountain. Not just. It's a trek, but it's up the mountain. Bethany is just up the mountain, and so it's at that healing of Lazarus that the declaration of the Pharisees come, we are going to kill him. Then we have the final Passover for Jesus. And so from chapter 11 on, it's the drama of what's to come, and the trial and the death, and then ultimately the resurrection of Jesus. So that's the gospel story there. Any other comments? Otherwise, I think we'll call it quits. I haven't decided if we're doing Yom Kippur or Purim. I don't know how to say that. Purim, I think. Next week. No, we're not. Oh, yeah.
We won't meet next week.
Yeah, let's not meet next week. We'll take a week off because the Friday night group's taking a week off. So we'll meet in 2 weeks. Okay, 2 weeks. All right. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Lord, thank you for this word. I pray, Lord, that it's accurate and that it breaks open your word for your people, that we too may dedicate our lives, every opportunity we get, to follow you because you and the Father are one. Amen.
Light to remind us of days long ago. Oh Hanukkah, come light the menorah. Let's join the party, we'll all dance the horror. Gather round the table, we'll give you a treat, a silly bone to play with and latkes to eat. And while we are playing, the candles are burning low. One for each night they shed a sweet light to remind us the days long ago. One for each night they shed a sweet light to remind us of days long ago.